paper is more from a perspective of urban history and urban planning history, not that much on art and art history and architectural history. Well, I'll focus in my presentation, as you mentioned already, on the interwar period. Okay. And well, I'll focus on these two cities, London and Hamburg. These two maps are not in scale, so London, of course, is much bigger. But you can see all the suburban areas which developed at the end of the 19th century and at the beginning of the 20th century. And it's important to underline that Hamburg was surrounded by three Prussian cities, so there were not many ways for extension. Well, together with industrialization and urbanization, also many anti-urban ideas were developed, and some of them reformistic, others more conservative. And the most famous one, of course, is the Garden City idea by Ebenezer Howard, which was very much based on social harmony, a village-like suburban settlements, small towns, and things like that. But I just mentioned this footnote. The Garden City idea was developed already 2 years earlier by a German called Theodor Fritsch, who was a racist and who wanted to improve the German race here in these garden cities. You can see, get out and work as a farmer and not read books and study books inside. So that was his perspective to improve the German race. But the question was, since the end of the 19th century, how to reorganize a big city, how to have a better structure, how to improve the housing working conditions. And there was an idea developed by a sociologist in the USA called Clarence Perry, and he had this idea to structure the city by neighborhoods. And the neighborhood was based on a number of inhabitants, about 5,000 people, and based on a community center and schools around this neighborhood center. And this was his perspective to reorganize a big metropolis by having these kind of different neighborhoods. And also, of course, for urban extension, this could be a good idea. And that was implemented in New York, but the idea was published in many journals, also in Germany, also in Britain, and well, it became a very popular idea because it seemed so simple. So here again, you can see plans for the future of London, here by the London Society, how to develop this area and how to have more detailed, better suburbs here, well, around King's Cross. And you can see how all these areas here developed in a form of urban sprawl where no structure in a way could be found. So this was the idea, and well, it looked like this, so monotonous house next to another, and of course, well, in a way, no structure can be found here. And many of these estates were built by private developers, but also many of them by the London County Council. And here you can see a map of the London County Council in the area in the period of 1918 until 1939. And you can see all these suburban areas which developed in between, which are, or which became later parts of London. And of course, this was very much based on public transport, on the infrastructure. Well, in the beginning on rail, of course, later trams, and then buses. And connected with buses, of course, there was this kind of sprawl, because it was much easier, of course, to get infrastructure, to get transport facilities, to commute by buses, because only a street is necessary, no train lines and things like that. And that was, of course, very much criticized, because the architecture, you can see it here, in a way is not very attractive. And well, this is a cartoon criticizing these developments. Well, and of course, the idea was one household, one house, and then, of course, some improvements inside. You can see here, of course, the woman talking about the gender perspective were responsible for raising up the kids, cooking, and things like that, but also some improvements inside the house, especially inside the kitchen, or here again, so the perspective, go outside of the dense urban areas, go to the suburbs, and then raise up the children there in a nice, beautiful surroundings. That was the idea, and one of the most famous estates built in this period was Beacon-Tree, an area built in the east of London with 25,000 units. So that means a population of about 100,000 people, and all buildings were designed by the LCC architect, and well, of course, looked quite similar. So these estates were called one-class estates, because you had these endless rows of houses based always on similar types. Miles ahead here, you can see always the same structure, where this should be kind of a center, but the neighborhood idea was also implemented here, because, of course, schools were necessary, infrastructure was necessary, so this was also integrated, and the LCC was also responsible for schools and the infrastructure here, of course. Well, and another estate, just one example, in a more dense area is the Ostelston estate next to Euston Station, which is well, more progressive architecture. You can see here an image of it. It's quite different from the typical LCC architecture which was used normally. And this was related to a slum clearance project, so buildings were demolished here, and then this quite modern estate was implemented here. But, well, the suburban areas developed very rapidly, and there was no control over this development, and a lot of critics on this development to have a better structure, kind of comprehensive structure and plan for London. And this is another famous book here you are probably familiar with, and another cartoon, so, well, cut all the trees and build and build and build these endless rows of houses. So that was the situation in London in the interwar period, and when we have a look at Hamburg, the situation in a way was a bit different. So this is a cartoon from the Social Democrats in 1918. When you go voting, vote the Social Democrats, and it reads, "We built a new world." And that was really the intention afterwards for one. So having better houses, control the urban development, no overcrowding, no slums anymore. And in Hamburg, this guy here became responsible for urban development and housing Fritz Schumacher, who came to Hamburg already before World War I, but he was responsible for many, many public buildings, about 33 schools, many other public buildings, and about 65,000 units which were built in Hamburg under his vision of planning urban settlements. And you can see these settlements here on this map, and they are built in a kind of a ring around the old Hamburg here in the center, because this land was available, this was owned by the municipality, so it was able to build new housing estates here. And as I mentioned before, there was no chance to extend this here because Hamburg was surrounded by Prussian cities. So Schumacher had this idea of what was called in German Licht, Luft, Sonne, light and air, and well, his housing estates, well, he was not the architect of all these buildings, but he controlled the development, and there had been architectural competitions for many buildings and different cooperatives who built these projects and so on. But in a way, he was responsible for the urban fabric in general, and then there were light terraces on top of the buildings here, for example. So a very different typology than the one before World War I. And housing, for example, just for women, single women which had a job in offices and other areas. So also, of course, the interior was changed, although I think Hoover was not available for working class household. Yeah, but the architecture changed, and you can see he used this brick architecture, and that's still famous for Hamburg, and Hamburg has got this nickname, the Red Hamburg, because the brick is used very often, and especially in all these housing estates built in the 1920s. And Schumacher, you can see it here, he reformed a plan existing from the end of the 19th century. So he developed a green area here, he planned playgrounds inside here, and he made larger blocks than had been here before. So talking about economics, it was possible to have, in a way, the same number of population, but improve housing conditions in these areas. Here are some more pictures well, with a balcony access here, for example, different courtyards you can see, but also this brick architecture, which is very common in the northern part of Germany, and also architects of modernism like Karl Schneider built housing projects under Fritz Schumacher's general design proposals. Well, that changed in 1933 when the Nazis took over the power, and then this idea of housing settlements came up at the periphery, well, again, similar to the Garden City perspective, and also based in a way on the neighborhood idea. So the rebirth, in a way, new life via Hitler's victory, and then images like this, villages with happy farmers working here, and these traditional houses which were then built in the 1930s. Here is another example from a housing estate, and they were built especially, of course, for armory workers used in the factories where they built tanks and other things. Yeah, this is another strange example. This is a concentration camp here, and then next to it they built this type of houses here, very traditional houses, and this is a shelter here, you can see, for the boss of the factory, so he can use the shelter if there is a bombing happening. Yeah, and that was in a way the changing ideology in the 1930s. You can see it here. Before 1930s, this kind of tenement structures here with high rents. Then the 1920s, which were called the system architecture here. Well, and then in the Third Reich, in the Nazi period, these happy homes with blonde children and so on. This was the ideology. Yeah, well, but there was also a general plan for Hamburg, and now I'm coming back to the level of urban planning. And there have been also plans, of course, for London when the Blitz happened or after the Blitz. So this was a famous plan here for the County of London from 1943 by Patrick Abercrombie and Forshaw from the London County Council. And you can see what they did. They said, well, that's a city. We cannot change the size of the city, but we can have neighborhoods surrounding the city. So they identified many, many neighborhoods here all around London, and the idea was to have a neighborhood center, what I mentioned before, and then identify a local population here which could identify with this area or with this area here in the eastern London, for example. That was a perspective, and that should be implemented after the war. And when we have a look at the plan from Hamburg, made in 1941 by a guy named Konstantin Gutschow, in a way it looked quite similar, but this plan was made in Hamburg before the bombing, which happened in 1943. You can see also this kind of structure of neighborhoods here around the center of the city. Here's the port area, and then you can see always green belts between these neighborhoods, also for bombing, of course, which was very important at that time. That was a plan from 1941, and then Abercrombie made another plan for Greater London, and you can see here, this is the LCC area, and all these buildings more or less had been built up, and then he made a proposal for having a green belt around London for the future. So that was his perspective in 1944, and having a look at the plan from Hamburg, which was also made in 1944, you can see the densities are much lower than they had been in the plan from 1941. So there are huge areas in between here. You can see empty, then a neighborhood, here a neighborhood, here a neighborhood, and so on and so on. So this happened, of course, as an experience of bombing, and as I mentioned, the bombing happened in 1943, and you can see until 1943, well, there was not that much houses demolished by bombing, but then in just 3 nights, half of the housing stock was gone, and all these buildings were demolished. So an opportunity, of course, for redevelopment after World War II. Yeah, and well, then of course there was a kind of a debate about the plans, what to do after World War II, and this was also seen as a big opportunity, as a chance for better cities in the future. You can see the war damage here in London, so of course mostly here in the area next to the River Thames and in the city center, but also in suburban areas. And well, this is a planner here proposing a new start, and well, this is his vision. Well, forget about the old plans, let's make a new plan. And you mentioned already many exhibitions had been done here in London, how to rebuild London after the Second World War. And then another proposal here you can see again, and it's again based on this perspective of neighborhoods. So Clapham, Brixton, and so on and so on. But you must turn this around, then you have a similar map like the other one. But that was a perspective to have better health conditions after the Second World War. Well, this perspective of the neighborhood planning was in a way changed in Germany during the Nazi period, and the Nazis developed this perspective to have a neighborhood not based on the school or as a school as a center, but based on the structure of the political party, of the Nazi party. So you can see here the structure of the Nazi party, and this would be one unit here of the Nazi parties. So quite similar to the neighborhood strategy, the neighborhood perspective, but as a center, always the meeting point here, a place for the Nazi party members to gather here to, of course the school was also included, but that was the Nazi perspective, how they changed the neighborhood idea. Well, just very briefly the plans after 1945, so this is a plan from 1951 for London, and I just mentioned very briefly one example here of reconstruction in Pimlico, and you can see here a totally different perspective, here built by Powell and Moyer. So you can see the kind of terraced houses, maybe influenced by Gropius or by Le Corbusier, but well, we have seen some of the housing projects in the lecture before, but quite unusual for London, and well, again, high-rise building with elevators, and totally different type, but also this type was based on the perspective of creating a new neighborhood. And these ideas were published in many journals, so the planners in Germany were very well informed about the plans which were made in London. And for example, they criticized the plans for East London. This was a plan here, part of the Abercrombie plan, and some of the Germans said it should be more what they called organic. And this was a structure here before World War II, and well, most of the buildings were blitzed here, and then they said, okay, it should be more organic and could look like this. So this was their proposal for improving the plan which was made here in London. Yeah, just showing you one example here in Hamburg for post-war housing, located here next to the Lake Ulster. And this was the plan made in 1950, and you can see well, what was developed after World War II were based on the experience of bombing. You can see huge green areas here in between all the housing estates and neighborhoods, and then again these neighborhoods here which you can clearly identify with a population of about 5,000 people. Well, the project I'm going to show you was planned as a headquarter of the British occupation force. And you can see the area was bombed very heavily here. Just some buildings survived. And then this plan came up here for high-rise buildings. There was another plan you can see that was not implemented. But then you can see here the architects, and well, these are the buildings which were built. And in the beginning, this should become the headquarter for the British occupation force, but then was combined with the American zone, and the headquarter was located in Frankfurt, and it was not used here in Hamburg anymore. But the project was just started here, and then the British would give it as a gift to the Senate of Hamburg, but the Senate of Hamburg said, well, we cannot use it because it was a steel construction and steel was not available at that time. So, well, at the end they took it, and then they changed the structure from offices to housing, and it became the first housing project after World War II in Hamburg, the first high-rise housing project, and you can see these happy people here who are living in this, in a way, unique housing project. There is nothing similar in Germany after World War II like this project. Yeah, well, to end up, the war was over, and the home front became more important now, and that was, of course, before the period of the Cold War then began. Thank you very much for your attention.